Well, hi folks, I'm Michael Wilhite and I am the District Coordinator for the Orange County Soil and Water Conservation District. I am coming to you today from the German Ridge Recreation Area down in beautiful Perry County, and I'm here to take you on a little virtual wildflower hike here through the recreation area. And along the way, we'll talk about some invasive species and how they're impacting our forests as well. Unfortunately, we are in the day and age of social distancing, so a number of events that we had planned have been canceled. I'm privileged to be involved with two different local SISMA organizations. A SISMA stands for a Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. And that basically is a grassroots organization which is dedicated to helping eradicate and educate about invasive species in our county so that we can hopefully get them underneath of control. An invasive species is a non-native species that has the ability to just take over the forest understory, if you will, and really cause some pretty serious damage environmentally and monetarily as well, as we'll see. And so I'm involved with, through my work, again, I work for Orange County Soil and Water. Through my work there, I'm involved with the Orange County Invasives Partnership. I actually live in Spencer County, though, and I'm helping to form the Spencer and Perry County SISMA group. We call ourselves PLANT. It stands for Perry and Spencer Land and Native Species Team. And I'm going to do this wildflower hike with you here at German Ridge in beautiful Perry County. I'm going to show you some wildflowers along the way. We'll talk about some invasive species along the way here, especially towards the end of the video here as well. And it'll apply both to equally to Perry and Spencer counties as well as Orange County, and it's really just all of southern Indiana. So I hope you'll join me along the way. German Ridge is a beautiful area as you pull into the parking lot with the little lake here. There's a nice little shelter house that you can use to have a picnic. There's some decent restroom facilities, and there's the nice little trail that starts here on the other side of it, and that's where we're going to be going down and looking at wildflowers today. That trail takes you back up to another parking area along the other side as well, so there's really a couple of ways that you can access this, and it's just a nice little beautiful trail through the forest. You encounter a couple of creeks and some you get some upland species, and you get some lowland species there as well. The trail itself is very nice, and it's well maintained along the way. So come along with me and let's enjoy looking at some invasive species and some wildflowers together. I'd argue this is probably one of our most distinctive wildflowers. It's pretty hard to miss this one, this kind of an umbrella shape, if you will. This is what we call mayapple. And it's easy to look at this and not understand that it's actually a wildflower. It's easy to sort of mistake it for just another plant that you would see in the woods, but you know, you just sort of see these leaves, but the flower is actually below. Now, this isn't quite flowering yet, but if I bend this up, you can actually see right here on below this is what the flower will be. And if I zoom in a little closer, you can see here in another few days, this beautiful little white flower that's going to appear on it will have popped out here. And but this is one that you can easily miss there. Now, this spreads underground by underground rhizomes, and so it's oftentimes that you see these form in colonies. If you see one mayapple, then you're going to find a lot of mayapples here. And as we go further into the woods, you'll see you'll see a whole lot more here. This is just a small example. Usually you'll find a large number of them. It's called a May apple because it blooms in May for the flowers, but it also has a little apple with it. And so after this flower is done blooming here, it'll set a little bit of a fruit on it that will sort of resemble an apple the later it gets into the season. And then, of course, this is a spring ephemeral as well. So by the time June, July, the heat of the summer hits, these leaves will all go away, and you won't even know this was there anymore. After I recorded that, I found this little mayapple that somebody had actually sort of trampled down setting like this, and I went to pick it back up to see if I could rescue it, and lo and behold, here is that beautiful mayapple right there with the flower open on it so that you can see. Again, you would not be able to recognize this if it were just covered up sort of like this. You wouldn't even think that it's there. Just another one of nature's really beautiful things for us to behold. Unfortunately, as you look at spring wildflowers, if you have a trained eye, you can also know that not everything is as it seems in the woods. Sometimes right besides beautiful things like these May-apples, you find little what looks like briar patches like this. This is actually multiflora rose. This is an invasive species. Now later on in the year, it will have all kinds of little white rose small flowers on it, and it is really pretty. It's an unintentional invasive. The government actually planted it for erosion control back many decades ago, well-meaning and thinking that everything was going to be all right. Unfortunately, they were wrong on that, and it produces some berries after it flowers. The birds love those berries, and it just distributes them all around, and it spreads like gangbusters. Well, this is another one of the beautiful spring ephemerals that we have out here. This is rue anemone, and you can tell the difference between this and another one called false rue anemone by looking at the number of petals. False rue anemone almost always only has 5 petals on it, and if you looked at these, for example, you would think that would be a possibility, as each of them has 5. But if you look on this one over here, you actually notice this one has 7 petals, and that identifies for me, along with the way the leaves are whorled on the stems rather than alternately presented on there. That tells me that this is rue anemone rather than false rue anemone. It's a beautiful little plant. Again, this is a spring ephemeral. It's not going to be one that lasts long, but sure is pretty to look at while it lasts. And right across the trail from that rue anemone was this little one as well. Just gives you a little bit of a nicer look at the petals. It's a little bit of a bigger plant there. And you can see again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 petals on this. That indicates for us that this is the true rue anemone. Well, this little spring ephemeral here is what we call cutleaf toothwort. You can kind of tell that by the shape of the teeth. You can see the leaves here just kind of have these teeth in them. Now, this is an early bloomer, and it's already bloomed, and you can actually see, the little small flowers would have been right here on it, but they're gone now. This is, like I said, one of the earlier ones that you would see at the beginning of the year. We're just a little bit late coming for it now. This is another example of cutleaf toothwort over here. You can actually see the leaves are starting to turn on that. These are spring ephemerals, and so their leaves will be gone in another month or so. You won't even notice that these were even here. It might be good for us to talk about what a spring ephemeral is. As I'm sitting here on the trail, just resting on this nice little rock, relaxing my feet, drinking a little bit of water. As I'm recording these videos to stitch all together into one big video for you, one of the things that I thought about is we haven't really discussed what a spring ephemeral is yet. A spring ephemeral is a wildflower that dies off pretty early on in the year. So once it starts to get into hot weather, the leaves and everything about it is going to be gone. It's a spring ephemeral. Ephemeral means it's very short-lived, all right? But it's a spring ephemeral in that what it does is it takes advantage of the light in the canopy from the forest in the spring. So if we look up here in the forest, we're starting to leave out now, but we're not fully leaved out yet. There's still quite a bit of sunlight here in the forest. Well, that sunlight is needed for those wildflowers to grow. So the spring ephemerals were taking full advantage of that sunlight that's still getting down into the canopy of the forest. And once that sunlight starts to be gone because the trees have all filled in here, say about late May into June, you'll see a lot of these spring ephemerals fade away. This is Spring Beauty. It's another one of those very early ones that you see of the spring ephemerals. It's very distinctive in the way its leaves, have these just 2 little slender leaves. It has beautiful little flowers on it, but as you can see here, the flowers are already spent on this one. And this one over here is already dead, and you can just kind of see a little bit more about these flowers here too. And it's one that blooms pretty early on in the season, and as a result of blooming very early on in the season, the later you get here, it's April the 22nd as I'm recording this video, and so the later on you get in the season, some of these earlier ones like Spring Beauty are going to be already gone, much like the cutleaf toothwort that I just showed you. And right as I said that, I stepped away, and about 5 feet away, I looked and noticed this. And here's a Spring Beauty that's actually got its flower still on it. And you can see here it is, mostly spent on that. There's one still to come on the top there. But there's what the Spring Beauty flower looks like. And again, it is just a gorgeous spring ephemeral. A little late in the season for this. It's surprising to see this one still blooming, but a nice treat nonetheless. Well, this is undoubtedly one of my absolute favorite of the wildflowers that you will encounter out here in the woods. This is a species of trillium. There are several species of trillium that are native to the area. This is prairie trillium. Now, It looks a little bit like sessile trillium, or toadshade trillium is another name for sessile trillium. But this is prairie trillium, and the way that you can tell that is by looking at the sepals right here. And if you notice on this how these sepals actually bend downward here, and if you look at the leaf structure itself, it's also very curved rather than straight out like you would see on the sessile trillium. That's kind of the way that I identify it. The Latin name for this, the scientific name, is Trillium recurvatum, and you can even hear the curving in the name, recurvatum, right? And so that's kind of an easy way to remember this. It's recurving down here, but just an absolutely beautiful species. These, by the way, are very hard to grow, so don't transplant these. If you were to actually dig this up from the woods and try to transplant it, it probably would not grow for you. They're very hard to grow, and you would also not leave anything here in the woods. It takes Trillium a very long time to get established, so this is certainly one of those where picking it is not advised, because you could actually help it go out of extinction in the woods. But you notice here, it also sometimes grows in colonies as well, and so down here you see a lot more of the prairie trillium as well. Again, these have not quite bloomed yet. They're a lot more immature. These could be younger plants. It could be less years on these than what others as well. Sometimes it takes our native wildflowers a few years to be able to produce these beautiful little wildflowers on the top of them. This is one of the reasons why native spring ephemerals are so important. Look at this beautiful little moth right here on this little sedum that I'm about to talk to you about. As I was getting my camera out and getting ready to talk to you about it, I noticed this little guy on there. This is a good illustration why these are just so important to us, because early on like this, when there's not much else blooming, our native pollinators literally depend on these things, and our pollinators have come to depend, if you will, on native plants and not invasive plants. Sometimes invasive plants will have flowers on them as well, but they don't provide maybe the same sugar content, the same nectar kind of content, and so they don't support our native species quite in the same way. But this is just one of those, you take a little walk through the woods and you see this, and it just is just so gorgeous, and it really helps you understand why you do what you do in dealing with species and promoting native species. The plant that it's on here is a type of sedum. I believe it is a woodland sedum. It's also called stonecrop. Has these beautiful little white flowers on it as well. And you can get stonecrop or sedum species and to be able to plant. And it's a good little spreading plant if you want to plant something. If you've got some rocks around your landscape and you want to plant something, it's a good little option for that. And just one other point of clarification, after I recorded that video and the butterfly flew off, I thought it was a moth, and then I got to looking at the video I had just recorded again and thought, well, that might be a butterfly, although it's awful early in the year for butterflies. So I used one of my ID guides, and it's actually a dusky wing butterfly. So just thought I would throw that in there. Another beautiful native that you might encounter is hairy sweet cicely. This one is going to bloom anywhere from April to June, although it's not bloomed yet. It's got these unique leaves on it, and if you look down here, again, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see there's some new growth starting to come on down here, and eventually this will produce some very small white flowers, and it'll be very pretty. It'll be very faint, but this one is just a little bit early. Here, another 2 or 3 weeks, it'll probably have some flowers on it. It's a little bit further down the line here. I noticed this another sweet cicely plant, and look at this one. It's mature enough, and so it's already got the flowers on it. And so I'll kind of go in here a little bit for you, and you can see those small white flowers that I was talking about. Just a beautiful spring ephemeral that if you just passed on by, you probably wouldn't see it because the flowers are so small. Sometimes a really good place to find some spring wildflowers is right along little streams. And then here is another great example of that one. This one is called star chickweed. It's a beautiful little spring ephemeral. As I kind of focus in here on the flowers here, you can see why it's called star chickweed, sometimes called great chickweed as well. But you see this very commonly with other things as well. For example, over here is some more of the rue anemone that I identified for you earlier, and there's even some Even there, even just some common blue violets here as well. So, lots and lots of diversity out here, especially as you get along streams like this. Star chickweed, or great chickweed, as it's called, both, oftentimes prefers these more moist kind of conditions. This beautiful little plant is called smooth Solomon's seal, and this also has a counterpart that looks very similar to it called false Solomon's seal. The way that you distinguish them is by the flowers. It would be easy to pass this over and think, well, that's not a wildflower, but much like the Mayapple, the flowers are on the underneath. Now, on this side, the flowers have not developed yet. We're just a little bit early yet, and this is a pretty young plant too. But on the underside of this, you notice that there are not any flowers yet, and I've checked on the few of the other ones that are around the area with this. There are several of them growing in here, but none of them have this yet. But one thing I can show you is the guidebook on this, and the picture from the guidebook just kind of shows you a little bit there, and you see those little flowers that hang down on it. If we were to find an actual Solomon seal plant that was flowering, you'd be able to see this. They bloom anywhere from around May to June, so we're just a little bit early on that. And then while we're just noting this, if you're looking for a great guidebook to take out with you and learn from, Wildflowers and Ferns of Indiana Forest is about the best one you can get, in my opinion. There's another one that you would probably pass up if you didn't know what it was. This is called Jack in the Pulpit, and it's a unique little wildflower. And this little hood right here, you see the little, you see Jack sticking up out of this this little hooded thing right here. The hooded thing is the pulpit. It sort of resembles pulpits of old from many centuries ago. And so you've got the Jack, or the preacher in the pulpit. I've heard it called both there. Jack here is the actual flower itself. If we were to sort of, if I bend this back a little bit, it may be hard for my camera to actually focus on and see, but if you bend this back and we were to look down into here, you would actually see that the flowers would be along the very base of that. It's kind of hard to see, and the flowers haven't developed on it yet, but they're very small, and they would be down there. This is a unique one because it's pollinated by flies mostly. It has this hood over it. It's sort of it's a dark area. Flies will fly into it, and then you see it looks a little lighter on the bottom there than what it does on the top, and so it tricks the flies into thinking, well, I'm trapped, I better fly down towards the light, and they end up pollinating the flower there at the bottom of it. And then once the pollination has occurred on this, the little hood pulpit, if you will fall off of this, and it'll just be Jack, and Jack will have some berries on it at the end. So it's a neat little species. And then coming out of the back of it, you have these leaves up here. So it's one you really have to look hard for to find. It's still pretty common in Indiana forests, but it's so small, and it doesn't have the showy wildflowers on it, but it is still a wildflower, and a very beautiful one at that. And this one is called hairy hawkweed. This is a unique one, and you see that the leaves down below are pretty unique as well. It's got these beautiful flowers. They almost look a little bit like a dandelion, don't they? And they act a little bit like a dandelion too. Once these flowers fall off, it'll resemble what's left of a dandelion after the dandelion flower is done as well, where you've got those seed pods, if you will, that just you can sort of pick it and blow it in the wind. Hairy hawkweed will have that same kind of effect. Another cool one that you'll see around the area is this little thing. You see it has this daisy-like flower on the top of it, although it's not 100% like daisy the common daisies, the Shasta daisies that you would plant in your garden and whatsoever. But it does have that daisy-like feature, and you see it has this very hairy stem, if you will, on it. This is daisy fleabane. Fleabane is a unique name, and it comes from the idea many years ago, before you had flea bombs and whatever that you could bomb your house with if your pets came in with fleas. Old timers hundreds of years ago would pick fleabane, and they would take it and scatter it through their house, and the feeling was that it was supposed to repel fleas from your house. Now, whether that works or not, I don't know, but that's how it's got the name fleabane. Flea's bane, the bane of a flea's existence, if you will. It would repel the fleas. Kind of a cool thing. Again, we have flea and tick collars on our pets, so I'm not sure whether it works or not, but a cool story nonetheless. One of the species that adds a whole lot of beauty to the forested land, especially of the yellow variety here, is golden ragwort. And as you zoom in on this, you see that there's just a lot of it here. They're beautiful little things. As I go in towards the top of them, you can see they look a lot like asters that you would plant in your garden, like a New England aster or something. Of course, those bloom later in the year, but this is actually in the aster family as well. It's just one that happens to bloom earlier in the year. Again, this is called golden ragwort, and it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But if you notice the yellow fields that you have out in out all over the roadside, especially whenever they've been disturbed by tillage and things like that, well, that is butterweed, and butterweed is also a cousin to this. And so you'll see that if you were to look at those side by side, you would see that they look very similar. Pachyra glabella is butterweed that you see out in your fields. Pachyra aurora is what you see here, golden ragwort. And again, just an absolutely beautiful, and here you've got a pollinator right there feeding on some nectar for it. So again, it just shows you why these native species are so important to us. And up just a little bit further down the line, you can see we have a pretty healthy colony here of golden ragwort. So this does form some dense clusters eventually as it has a chance, and it's just absolutely beautiful. You do know it's not a monoculture, though. You look and you see there's some May-apples back in the background here, and still, you know, there's other little things down here besides this as well. But I've stood here for the past several minutes and watched several different butterflies and bees. They just absolutely love this. This is one of the important spring ephemerals that we have. While we are on the subject of golden ragwort, a little bit later down the line here I found this. This is another beautiful example of the golden ragwort. But remember I said it looks very similar to its cousin, butterweed, that you would find out in the field. And indeed, if we just step over here, there's your golden ragwort right there. If you just step over here, here's your butterweed. And you notice the leaves on this one are much different. You don't have those round heart-shaped leaves at the base of them here. But you notice here that the flowers, there's not as many of them here as there were on the golden ragwort, but they are just about the same as what you would find on it otherwise. And so if you were to just look at the flowers alone, here's another butterweed right here. So again, if you just looked at the flowers alone, there's your butterweed, and then here's your golden ragwort flowers. It would be very hard, more golden ragwort, very hard to tell them apart as far as that goes. But again, related species. Well, this little beauty you see here is in the buttercup family. There are several of the buttercups that occur native in Indiana. This particular one is swamp buttercup, and it loves wet feet. It loves to be right along creek sides, and it loves to be in floodplains. And of course, look where we are. There's this beautiful little creek that runs through here. As you go through this floodplain, you notice a number of those little swamp buttercups are growing over here. But one of the ways that you can identify this pretty easy from another common one that looks very similar to it, the hispid buttercup, is this hairy stem. And as you look down here, you notice that the stem is very hairy. If I could get it to focus anyway, you would be able to see that. Maybe if I put my finger in there, you can see it a little bit better. But yeah, you can start to see it a little bit. But yeah, there you go. You notice that how hairy the stem is on this. So that's a good way to identify this one. Again, swamp buttercup. And you also see the little shiny leaves on it as well. The shiny leaves are another one of those little indicators for us that help us to identify it. Well, here we have a couple of beautiful species here in this little floodplain that I'm in. So the first off, this is wild geranium, a beautiful little one that you can see here, and it's very easily identified by its leaves. It looks sort of like the geraniums, and its flowers even look like the geraniums that you have cultivated in your garden in a similar way. But this is the native. The flowers are usually the pale lavender like this. Sometimes they're a little bit of a brighter, but this is the most common of those colors. And then over here you have violet wood sorrel, and let me see if I can get, hold on, I'm sorry, I'm covering up the camera there with my finger. If I can kind of get this and bend it back, you can see the flower a little bit. But really, the distinctive mark on this, you notice down here, are these little leaves showing some oxalate deposits down here. And if you just look for this tiny orange spot right here on this leaf, that's one of the ways that you can identify violet wood sorrel pretty easily there. But again, another little plant that likes wet feet, hence along with the wild geranium down here in the little floodplain. Right over by it is another one of these wild geraniums, and I just wanted to point out that this one has a little bit of a deeper purple colander rather than the more lavender color of the other one. So there is some natural variation in these species. One of the more common wildflowers that you'll see, especially in areas that get just a little bit more light, like the edge of the forest, for example, here, is wild blue phlox. And this is just another one of those beautiful ones that I absolutely love. You can get garden phlox as well, and it looks very similar. It's a little bit different than the cultivated phloxes that you'd get in your landscaping. It's a little bit different than this wild one, but very similar, and it's just an absolutely beautiful one. Then there's another invasive species that looks very similar to this called Dame's Rocket, and a lot of people get them confused, but the easiest way to identify them is by the number of petals on here. You notice that each one of these on wild blue phlox has 5 petals. Dame's Rocket will have 4 petals. Dame, D-A-M-E, 4 letters, 4 petals. Phlox, P-H-L-O-X, 5 letters, 5 petals. At least that's the easiest way that I find to remember it. It isn't really a wildflower, but certainly worthy of consideration as well as the flowering dogwood. This is just an absolutely beautiful small tree that puts on a real show in the springtime like this. Has these gorgeous white flowers on it, and it's just a really awesome alternative, native alternative to the terrible invasive calorie pear or something like that. This one is this is certainly one that you want to plant, and just like I say, absolutely beautiful and fairly small too. They like sunshine, so this is kind of growing on the edge of the forest along the trail here, but certainly complements the spring wildflowers, doesn't it? Another spring wildflower that we ought to talk about is actually not a native one at all. It's actually an invasive species, and this is garlic mustard, but it does have this little white flower on the top of them that some people will enjoy. But you can see the way the leaves look like on this. If you actually take one of these off and then crush it up, you would smell kind of a garlicky scent. This was actually planted as an herb where you could harvest this. I wouldn't recommend harvesting it for right now. It's pretty, once it's gone to flower, it's pretty rough, but you could still make a pesto out of it. But some people will use it for that. Unfortunately, this is an invasive species, and this can create one of those dense monocultures like what we like what you see sometimes, and it can really be a problem. So this is certainly one that if you see it, the best thing to do is to get rid of it, and the easiest way to do that is to just pull it up, and it has this long root on that. Since it's already gone to flower, the best thing to do with this is to throw it in a trash bag or a Walmart sack or something like that, whatever you have, and then dispose of it in the trash, because if you just leave it on the ground here, because it's already flowered, it could go to seed, and you could end up having more around the area. There. So I've got my backpack on, and I've got a little Walmart sack in there. So what I'll do is I'll crunch this up, throw it in there, and then get rid of it, so that way it's not spreading more in the forest. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our time together on this wildflower walk and found it useful. I know I have enjoyed recording these videos, and I'm looking forward to getting this all put together for you. I want to end this, though, with a little bit about invasive species, because if we just talk about spring wildflowers, and we don't really talk about the threat that invasive species have to them, we haven't really done our job well enough yet. We're fortunate enough here at German Ridge Recreation Area to not have a ton of invasive species, and that's why we've seen such a wide diversity, if you will, of the wildflowers that I've been able to show you today. It isn't that case everywhere. Now, there are some invasive species here along the trail. Along the way, I've noted some multiflora rose, and I'm sure there are some others as well. But let me take you down the road just a little bit to Lincoln State Park in Spencer County. Lincoln is a beautiful park. There's some great trails on there, but unfortunately, that's a state park that is just riddled with invasive species. And there's one section of a trail that I want to show you that I think as you look at it, you'll really get a good idea in your mind about why invasive species are such a bad thing for our forests. So hang with me, and you'll see what I mean. Well, as promised, we are at Lincoln State Park, and we are on Trail 6, and this is what I mean by invasive species. We are on this nice little trail that goes back to a lake that used to be an old strip coal mine that they've turned into a lake. And it's a beautiful little trail system, and it does have some spring ephemerals along the way here as well. You notice there's a nice little dogwood right over here, and so that's a nice little pretty thing to look at. But overall, this little section of the trail is just riddled with invasive species. You notice this thick carpet of this ground cover right here. This is periwinkle. And if we were here about 2 or 3 weeks ago, you would see this blooming. There are still a few blooms left. Has this kind of a purple bloom here. It would have been a sea of purple. It was because I was here, but I didn't take the video then. But now that we are, you're starting to see a few other things grow through where it was just nothing but that carpet about 3 weeks ago. There are a few other things in here, but you just notice how it is sort of taken over everything. Periwinkle, if you ask, well, how did this end up getting here? Periwinkle is not a native plant, and it's not something you find out in the wild like this, or you're not supposed to find it out in the wild anyway. It's actually a landscaping plant. It was meant as a ground cover, and it works as a great ground cover if you are just putting it in a little shaded area on the north side of your house, and you've got just a small area you want ground for. Periwinkle works great for that, especially whenever you can just mow it. It doesn't really escape cultivation there because you can just mow around it and keep it where you want. The problem is, though, whenever it escapes cultivation by the berries that it forms and things like that, birds eat those berries, and then they end up excreting out the seeds into forests like this, and then all of a sudden you get these dense colonies formed of something like this that should have never been here. Now, that's not the only thing that's out here, but it's almost a monoculture. You notice there are a few trees that are popping up through here as well, but overall, through most of the ground plants, well, way back in here, if I zoom in just a little bit, you can see sort of right back in here, there's a little bit of yellow there. There's some golden ragwort that's back there, but otherwise, for the most part, it's really just a sea of periwinkle. And unfortunately, there are a few other invasive species as well. There's a nice little stand of multiflora rose, a thicket down through here as well. So this gives you a really good idea of why invasive species are such a problem. Multiflora rose, unfortunately, is not native to our area either. It's invasive. Department of Agriculture planted it years ago for erosion control in agricultural fields, thinking that it would be a good thing. Unfortunately, we know better now, and it's not a good thing. It's a very bad thing, and it's taking over woodlands. And as I look through this, it's just a sea of invasive species. And in this little section, you've got periwinkle, you've got multiflora rose, there's some bush honeysuckle in there, there's some winter creeper in there, there's some garlic mustard along the trails. It's just invasive species almost as far as the eye can see with this. And the reason why that's such a bad thing is because as you look at this and you see, there's a sprig or two of golden ragwort and maybe some other spring ephemerals in there, but not very much, not compared to what we've been seeing. Not compared to what we have been seeing anyway. And as you look on the other side, you see kind of a similar situation where you've got a good number of the understory over here taken over, if you will, by these invasive species. And so that's why planting native species is so important in our home landscaping, because if you plant native species, you don't have the problem of these invasives escaping cultivation and ruining our wildlands. And why is that so important? Well, let me show you why, and we'll talk about it. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this little virtual wildflower hike that we have been on. I want to end our discussion today with talking about why native species are so important. We've looked at how beautiful the spring wildflowers are, and we've looked at how to identify a number of them. And we've also talked about the threat of invasive species and why it's important that we need to contain that. But why are natives so important to us? Well, how many of you all like to attract birds to your backyard and things like this? Well, birds depend on native species to be able to live. You say, well, of course, they're going to have bird seed and things like that. You can always feed them. But most birds really are going to need caterpillars and things like that to be able to survive, to feed their young, and just to be able to survive in general. If you don't have our native species, you're not going to have those caterpillars. They're just not going to be around, because those caterpillars have grown over the thousands of years that we have been around here to feed on very specific types of plants. So if you've ever heard of what a host plant is, for example, Certain butterflies, certain moths, things like this will each have what they call a host plant. A host plant is just a very specific plant that is used. So, for example, if we were to talk about the zebra swallowtail, it's a beautiful butterfly that looks a lot like a zebra. Its host plant is the pawpaw tree, and it's exclusively the pawpaw tree. There's nothing else it'll host on. So, if you don't have any pawpaw trees, you don't have any zebra swallowtails anymore, right? So that's a big problem. Tiger swallowtails are another beautiful one of our native butterflies. They host on tulip trees and wild cherry trees and just a few other things, but not a whole lot else. Theirs is pretty limited as well. Well, if you crowd out all of these native trees and native bushes like spice bush, the spice bush swallowtail only uses spice bush and a couple of other trees as well. But if you crowd out all of these with invasive species and you don't leave room for native species anymore, well, the problem that you have with that is that you don't have these butterflies around anymore because their caterpillars will feed exclusively on the leaves of these host plants. If you don't have the caterpillars feeding on these host plants, then you don't support the birds that are going to be able to feed on these caterpillars to be able to live. And so, and it's just on and on down the line, because the reality is here that our food web is all dependent on one another. And so if you attack one part of the food web, it's going to have a domino effect, and it's going to go on to attack the rest of the food web in some way, shape, or form as well. That's why planting native in our landscapings is so important when you can. I understand there are some non-natives that are perfectly fine. Tulips and bearded irises and things like that are beautiful, and they're not harming anybody. But for the most part, in your landscaping, choose natives when you possibly can, because it supports our native species. And for sure, don't plant invasive species. Learn how to identify those invasive species. Control those invasive species on your land. If you don't know how to do that, you think that you've got some invasive species on your land and you'd like to learn how to identify them and like to learn how to control them, contact us here. You're watching this video on YouTube or Facebook. Reach out to us and we'll reach back out to you. We have some invasive species specialists that we can hook you up with. We'll come out to your land free of charge, walk the land with you and show you what kind of invasive species you got and how you might be able to control it. If you want more information, at the end of this video, I'll have some websites for you there as well that you can go to. There you can get some more information on this. I hope you have enjoyed this little wildflower walk in our discussion on spring ephemerals and invasive species. We'll do some more of these as the social distancing continues on. Hopefully it won't continue on forever, but we're probably in this for the long haul. So it's going to be a little while before we can do face-to-face events like this again, but I look forward to that day we can get back together and do these kind of face-to-face events again. Got any questions? Drop them in the comments below, and we'll be happy to get back with you. Thanks for watching.